All right, so you said some pretty interesting stuff,
Yeah.
and what we're going to try to do here is pull out the key insights, the things that might make you go, aha. And we are diving deep into the science of how we learn.
Ooh.
We're going to be looking at a model called the Interactive Layers Model of Self-Regulated Learning and Cognitive Load.
Okay.
And our guide for this exploration is a 2020 paper. It's from Educational Psychology Review
All right.
by Worth and some colleagues. Now, the really cool thing about this deep dive, I think, is that it's suggesting that learning isn't all about conscious effort. You know, the stuff that you are deliberately trying to do. There's all this stuff going on behind the scenes that your brain is doing that you're probably not even aware of. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So,
Yeah, I think that's right. The traditional models of learning and cognitive load really focus on conscious processes, right? So, what's happening in your working memory? What are you consciously aware of? How are you storing information in your long-term memory? But this model suggests there's a whole other layer, a whole other way of learning and regulating your learning that's happening without you even being aware of it. And that's what makes it so fascinating, I think.
absolutely. It's not just about the deliberate study habits. There's
Yeah.
so much more going on.
Yeah.
And this is where this model, the interactive layers model, comes in, because it actually starts to take that into account. So it sort of gives us a bigger picture, a more holistic picture.
Right.
And it includes sensory memory
Yeah.
as well as working and long-term memory. So that's kind of interesting in itself. And then what really got me was the fact that it distinguishes between conscious and unconscious self-regulated learning.
Mm.
So it's not just, what you're actively doing to try and learn. So this model suggests that there are actually two distinct types of self-regulation when it comes to learning.
Yeah.
So the first one is unconscious self-regulated learning.
Right.
And this is kind of kickstarted, it begins with what they call resonant states in our sensory memory.
Exactly.
And here's the really cool thing. It seems that this type of self-regulation, this unconscious self-regulation, doesn't add to our cognitive load.
That's right. No additional mental effort required, which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, so no mental load.
Yeah, it's like a superpower.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
So tell me more about these resonant states. What are they, and how do they get this kind of, unconscious learning engine going?
Sure. So the idea of resonance actually stems from something called adaptive resonance theory, or ART.
Oh, okay.
Now, you can think of ART as your brain's sort of built-in filtering system, right?
Yeah.
It very quickly decides what is new and important to pay attention to and what is familiar and can just sort of fade into the background. And that's really helpful because it prevents us from being completely overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information that we're constantly bombarded with, right?
Mhm.
If we had to consciously process everything, we'd just be overloaded. And this also relates to something known as the stability plasticity dilemma.
Okay.
Have you heard of that?
No, I don't think so.
So basically, it's this constant challenge that our brains face, right? We need to be able to rapidly learn new things and adapt to new situations, which is the plasticity part, but we also need to maintain the stability of what we already know so we don't just forget everything we've learned before.
Right.
So RT and these resonant states are part of how our brain tries to manage this balance between stability and plasticity.
Wow, that's super interesting. So this resonance thing, it's about like recognizing patterns, recognizing when something's familiar. How does that actually lead to learning?
Yeah, that's a great question. So resonance happens when there's a match between the information that's coming in through our senses. That could be anything we see, hear, touch, taste, smell, right?
Yeah.
And the expectations that our brain has, which are based on past experiences, right? And these past experiences, they get stored in our long-term memory as what we call schemes, which are kind of like knowledge structures, right? So
Right.
if the sensory information coming in matches what our brain already anticipates, these signals, they kind of reinforce each other, they amplify each other, and that creates this resonance. So it's like a mental, yes, I recognize this.
So it's like a mental echo chamber where you've got the incoming information and the existing knowledge bumping into each other and kind of getting stronger if they match.
Precisely, yeah, that's a great way to put it. And when this resonance occurs, it increases the likelihood that this information will move into our conscious awareness, that it'll be transferred to our working memory for more detailed processing. However, and this is really important, the model says these resonant states, they don't always have to become conscious. They can actually remain unconscious right there in our sensory memory.
Okay, so this is where it starts to get really interesting for me. So if it's unconscious, how does it contribute to learning?
Right. So even without becoming conscious, a resonant state in sensory memory still allows this incoming information to kind of interact with our long-term memory,
Yeah.
right? And this interaction can lead to the information being encoded, becoming part of our long-term knowledge. So it's contributing to learning without ever needing to be consciously processed in our working memory.
Wow. So it kind of like bypasses that whole conscious bottleneck.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like a backdoor to learning.
That's amazing. So, like, our brains can be constantly learning and updating in the background, triggered by these familiar patterns, and we don't even realize it's happening.
That's right. It's a very efficient way of learning, especially for things that are repeated frequently or that fit well with our existing knowledge. And to kind of help us understand how this all fits together,
Yep.
the model proposes three interacting layers, you could say, in our brain.
Okay.
So first, we've got the content layer.
Okay.
And this is all about the actual stuff we're learning, the material itself, right?
Mhm.
And how we build those mental schemes that we talked about before, those knowledge structures that represent our understanding. Then there's the learning strategy layer.
Yeah, okay.
And this one is all about the techniques we use to learn, right?
Yeah.
Like summarizing or asking ourselves questions or whatever it might be. And then finally, we've got the metacognitive layer, which is basically our brain's internal monitoring system for learning. It's
Yeah.
how we keep track of how well we're doing, whether we understand something or not, and how we make adjustments to our learning process.
So it's not like these are separate compartments in our brain.
Not at all.
They're all connected and influencing each other.
Right. And it's through these interactions between the layers that both conscious and unconscious monitoring and control can happen. So it does get a bit complex.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But it also gives us a much more nuanced understanding of learning. It's not just about the conscious stuff.
Okay. So let's go back to these resonant states for a moment.
Sure.
You used the term unconscious self-regulation before.
I did, yes.
Could you maybe give us an example, like, from everyday life to really illustrate what that means?
Of course, yeah. The paper uses a really good analogy. Driving a car.
Okay.
Think about all the sensory information you're processing while you're driving, right?
Right.
What you see, the feel of the steering wheel, the sounds of the engine, and the traffic around you, it's a lot of information to take in. But most of the time, we're not consciously thinking about every single action that's needed to keep the car on the road, are we? Like, if you're driving on a familiar, straight road, staying in your lane often feels very automatic.
Right. Yeah.
So the model suggests that this is actually due to resonant states, right? The sensory input from the road is matching your brain's expectation of what it means to stay on track, and that creates resonance. And as long as everything's predictable, there are no surprises, this information doesn't necessarily need to be consciously processed in your working memory.
You can still listen to the radio, or have a conversation.
Exactly. Yeah, you're not using all of your mental capacity just to keep the car going straight.
Right. So the familiar, the routine can kind of just happen without too much mental effort.
Precisely. But now imagine, you suddenly come across a detour or there's a construction zone up ahead. So suddenly, the sensory information you're receiving, the unexpected signs, the lane closures, that no longer matches your expectations, right?
Yeah.
And this mismatch can be strong enough to disrupt that unconscious resonance and push that information into your working memory. Now you start consciously reading those signs, actively adjusting your steering. You might even turn down the radio because your mental workload has suddenly increased.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the unexpected forces us to pay attention, whereas the expected, can kind of be handled more automatically.
Right.
Okay. So how does the actual learning of new information happen within this framework?
So within the content layer, remember that first layer, the model proposes two main ways we build our understanding, right? So the first one is what they call conscious scheme construction.
Okay.
And this is actually the traditional view of learning that we're all familiar with. This
Yeah.
is where we actively bring sensory information and our existing knowledge into our working memory,
Right.
And then we consciously try to organize that information, connect it, rehearse it, and so on. And as we know, this effortful process, it requires mental energy, it induces cognitive load. This is what we normally think of as explicit learning.
Right. So the deliberate effort to try and build knowledge and understanding.
Yeah. But the second way is unconscious scheme acquisition.
Okay.
And this is where it gets really interesting again, because this is related to something called implicit learning. And this type of learning, it occurs when we encounter similar learning situations repeatedly.
Okay.
So the sensory information from those repeated experiences, it kind of gradually builds up unconscious expectations in our sensory memory.
Okay.
And when the sensory input from a new event matches these unconscious expectations, it creates resonance. And that makes it more likely that this information will be transferred directly to our long-term memory and contribute to a scheme. And all of this happens without ever having to go through working memory, so there's no real cognitive load involved.
So just by being exposed to things repeatedly, we can learn patterns, form expectations without even trying.
Exactly, yeah. It's learning by osmosis, almost. Like,
Yeah.
think about learning the subtle social cues in a new culture.
Right.
You might start to pick up what's considered polite or impolite just by observing people, by being exposed to those situations repeatedly without consciously analyzing each interaction.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
But the model does point out a really important difference between these two types of learning.
Okay.
So implicitly learned schemes, they're often just associations, right?
Okay.
You might learn that X often follows Y, but you don't necessarily understand why. Whereas consciously constructed schemes, they involve that active processing and working memory, and that leads to a deeper understanding of the underlying principles.
So there's a difference between just knowing what and understanding why.
Precisely, yeah. And that's often the difference between implicit and explicit learning.
Okay. And I guess now we should move on to the learning strategy layer. How does this model view the strategies we use to learn?
Yeah, great question. So traditionally, when we think about self-regulated learning, we think about learners consciously choosing and using strategies based on the task, their knowledge of different strategies, and their personal goals, right?
Right.
So to do this well, you need to have knowledge about the strategy itself, so like what it is, how to use it, and also what we call conditional knowledge, which is knowing when and why it's the right strategy for the situation.
Right. So it's very much an intentional, thoughtful process of selecting the right tool for the job.
Yeah, exactly. And research has shown that we do get better at using these strategies over time, right?
Right.
We start by consciously thinking through each step, and then with practice, it becomes more automatic, more like a procedure, and eventually we develop this kind of intuition about when and why to use different strategies effectively. But, in the beginning, it does require conscious effort.
So becoming good at using learning strategies is a learning process in itself, going from conscious effort to more automatic application.
That's right. And it's a process that can take time and practice.
Hmm.
But the interactive layers model actually adds an interesting twist to how we use these strategies, right?
Okay.
It suggests that sometimes, especially with well-practiced strategies, the learning task itself can actually trigger our knowledge of that strategy without us consciously deciding to use it.
So just by being presented with certain tasks, it automatically kicks in the most appropriate strategy.
In a way, yeah. The model refers to these cues in the task as task affordances. So think of affordances as the built-in opportunities or cues within the learning activity. So for example, headings in a text afford the opportunity to skim for an overview.
Okay.
And when these cues match our well-developed understanding of when to use a particular strategy, it can create a resonance in our sensory memory, which then leads to the unconscious application of that strategy, saving us mental effort.
So the way information is presented can almost automatically guide our learning strategies if we're experienced enough.
Yeah, exactly. It's like our brain has learned to recognize certain patterns in the learning environment and automatically trigger the most efficient strategy for dealing with them.
Wow, that's incredible. So I guess we can kind of move on to the metacognitive layer now.
Yeah.
This is the monitoring and control of our learning.
Right.
How does the model account for unconscious processes in this layer?
Okay, good question. So traditionally, we think of metacognition as a very conscious process, right? It involves our knowledge about ourselves as learners, the task at hand, and the strategies we can use. It also includes our conscious experiences of learning.
Like realizing that you're struggling to understand something.
Exactly, yeah. Or noticing that you're getting distracted.
Yeah.
So based on this awareness, we consciously set goals, we choose strategies, we monitor our progress. It's all very deliberate.
Right. So it's that internal dialogue that we have with ourselves while we're learning.
Exactly. We're constantly checking in, making adjustments. And Jean Flavel, who is kind of like the godfather of metacognition research, he suggested that our metacognition metacognitive knowledge can be consciously activated, which then leads to these metacognitive experiences and then to conscious regulation in our working memory.
Okay.
But he also hinted at the idea that there might be cues in the learning situation itself that can trigger this metacognitive knowledge without us being aware of it.
Right.
And this is where the interactive layers model picks up the baton, so to speak.
Okay.
It takes that idea and runs with it. So the model proposes that if the cues in the learning task match our metacognitive knowledge, like our understanding of what makes something difficult or how well we're likely to remember it, if those things match, it can create resonance in our sensory memory. And this resonance, even if it doesn't reach our conscious awareness, can still directly influence our learning.
Okay.
So it leads to what they call unconscious metacognitive regulation.
Okay. So this is metacognition happening behind the scenes without us even realizing it. So our internal knowledge about learning is kind of subtly steering our progress based on what's happening around us without us actively thinking about it.
Exactly, yeah. It's like having an autopilot for your learning. So, for example, imagine you're reading a book, right?
Yeah.
And you're really enjoying it. You're finding it easy to follow. You're just kind of turning the pages. You're immersed in the story. So your monitoring of your understanding and your decisions about how to proceed, they might be happening completely automatically in the background, driven by these unconscious resonances.
Right.
But then you suddenly encounter, a really dense paragraph full of jargon or something you just don't understand.
Okay.
So now those metacognitive cues, like encountering unfamiliar words, realizing you're not grasping the main idea, those cues can become strong enough to break that unconscious flow and push you into conscious, effortful metacognitive regulation.
Right.
So now you might reread the paragraph, slow down, maybe even look up a definition. And you're very aware of the fact that you're doing this, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So there's definitely a shift from that kind of automatic to the more deliberate monitoring. And I think that's something we can all relate to. Okay, so we've got these three layers: content, strategy, and metacognitive, constantly interacting. Sounds pretty complicated. How does the model actually explain these interactions?
Well, it emphasizes that these layers aren't isolated, right? They're constantly influencing each other in both a top-down fashion.
Okay.
So that's from our knowledge and our goals, and also in a bottom-up fashion, so that's from the information itself.
Right.
And they're basically representing the monitoring and control processes we've been talking about, conscious and unconscious. So these interactions can be both intentional and conscious, happening in our working memory and therefore requiring mental effort. Like when you consciously decide to use a specific note-taking strategy to help you understand a complex concept, and you're actively checking to see if your notes are capturing the key information.
Right. So that's kind of like active, engaged learning.
Exactly, yeah. You're very aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it. But the model also suggests that these interactions can occur automatically and unconsciously within sensory memory without any conscious effort.
Oh, interesting.
So, for example, think about judgments of learning, or JOLs, which are basically our attempts to predict how well we'll remember something in the future. So the model suggests that conscious JLLs involve a bottom-up interaction between the content we're learning and our metacognitive knowledge in working memory.
Okay.
So basically, we consciously think about what we've just learned and we make a prediction about our future recall.
Right.
But then you have things like the feeling of knowing, or FOKs, which is that sense that you know something even if you can't quite bring it to mind right now.
Okay. Yeah.
So the model proposes that these FOKs could actually be an example of an automatic, unconscious interaction, maybe a resonance-based interaction between the content and metacognitive layers in our sensory memory.
Interesting. So that gut feeling that you know the answer, but you just can't quite remember it.
Exactly.
That might have a basis in these unconscious resonances.
That's the idea, yeah.
Okay.
Another great example is when you're reading a text and you encounter highlighted words.
Okay.
So this is a really good example of how all three layers can interact, because this metacognitive cue, right, the highlighted word,
Yeah.
it can trigger a cascade of resonant states across all three layers. So it activates your knowledge about why words are highlighted. That's the metacognitive layer, which then prompts you to maybe pay more attention to them or skim them first.
Right.
That's the learning strategy layer. And then finally, this influences how you actually process that highlighted content.
Right. Okay.
And all of this can happen relatively automatically without needing a lot of conscious thought.
So it's like our brains are these incredibly active processors.
Yeah.
They're constantly making connections, making adjustments, even when we're not consciously directing everything.
Ab-
So the paper also talks about how this model can kind of help us understand some of the findings in self-regulated learning research that have always seemed a little bit contradictory.
Right, yeah.
Can you walk us through some of those?
Yeah, sure. So one area where we've seen kind of mixed results is in the correlation between self-reported use of self-regulation strategies and actual learning outcomes. So sometimes you find a strong link, which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
The more you use these strategies, the better you learn. But other times the connection is weak or even non-existent. And the interactive layers model suggests that this inconsistency might be because more experienced learners could be relying heavily on unconscious self-regulation, which wouldn't necessarily be captured by, typical questionnaires that focus on conscious strategy use.
Right, so if it becomes more automatic, you might not even be aware of all the steps that you're taking.
Exactly. And you wouldn't be able to report it accurately on a questionnaire. And the Leopold and Lutner study from 2002, I think it was, which looked at students in different grade levels. It provides a nice example of this. So they found that using what they called deep level learning strategies was more strongly linked to good learning outcomes as students got older.
Okay.
Which kind of fits with the idea of, increased conscious strategy use the more experience you have.
Right.
However, the relationship between using metacognitive strategies and learning outcomes, that didn't follow such a clear pattern. So our model suggests that maybe older students are relying more on those unconscious metacognitive processes, which wouldn't be fully reflected in their self-reports compared to younger students who are probably more aware of those metacognitive activities because they're still more conscious. They
Right.
haven't been automated yet,
So experience can lead to a kind of invisible self-regulation that's still very effective.
Precisely. It's like a hidden advantage that experienced learners have. And another thing that's kind of puzzled researchers is the difference we sometimes see when we use different methods to assess self-regulated learning, right? So like asking students to fill out questionnaires versus having them think aloud while they're learning.
Okay.
So the model suggests that if learners are under a heavy cognitive load, they might prioritize processing the actual learning material and have less mental space available to be aware of and accurately report on their metacognitive process.
Right. Yeah.
And there's a study, the Rogiers et al. Study from 2020, that found exactly this. So students were reporting that they frequently checked their understanding when they answered questionnaires, but these moments of checking weren't actually observed as often in what they said out loud while they were learning.
Right.
So this kind of fits with the idea that when our conscious attention is focused on the content, we might not be as aware of those internal monitoring processes that are happening.
It's like our mental bandwidth gets so full with the what that we don't have the resources to focus on the how anymore.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Okay. And there was also the underconfidence with practice effect.
Yes, the UWP effect. This one's really interesting.
So Coriat and his colleagues, they found that, after an initial study session, learners tend to overestimate how much they've actually learned. But then, after they've practiced more, they actually start to underestimate their improvement.
Yeah.
So the model suggests that this might be because, with repeated practice, a lot of the learning is actually happening unconsciously through these resonant states in sensory memory.
That's right.
And because learners aren't consciously aware of all this learning that's taking place, they underestimate how much they've actually improved.
Yeah, it's like they're getting better without realizing it. And this kind of highlights the importance of those unconscious processes, right? They can have a significant impact on learning, even if we're not aware of them.
So we're absorbing more than we think, and that kind of throws off our conscious assessment of our learning.
Exactly. And finally, the model also provides a potential explanation for the expertise reversal effect.
Okay.
So this is the phenomenon where instructional methods that are really beneficial for novices can actually hinder the learning of experts.
Right.
So the model suggests that this happens because experts already have, these highly developed knowledge structures across all three layers,
Okay.
which allows them to process information very efficiently, often automatically, through resonant states. So if you provide them with additional information or strategies that don't really align with these existing knowledge structures, it can disrupt those automatic processes, increase their cognitive load, and make learning less effective.
So what's meant to support learning can actually get in the way for people who already have a strong foundation.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like giving someone who's already fluent in a language a beginner's textbook. It's not going to be very helpful, and it might even be confusing.
Right. Okay, so how can we actually test this model, especially the idea of unconscious strategy use? What are some things that researchers could do to investigate this further?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, one approach would be to create learning tasks that offer very clear cues for using a particular strategy that people are already familiar with, right? And then you can observe their behavior, maybe through eye tracking or, just by watching how they interact with the material. And then you compare that to what they say they're doing.
Okay.
So the idea is that if they're using the strategy unconsciously, their behavior should show it, even if they don't explicitly say, I'm doing this.
Right.
So for example, with the highlighted words in a text, eye tracking data might show an experienced learner automatically focusing on those highlighted words first, even if they don't explicitly tell you that they're scanning for key information.
Right.
Whereas if you introduce an obstacle, like highlighting some irrelevant words as well, you might see that disruption in the automatic processing, and they might start verbalizing their thought process more
Yeah, okay.
because now they realize that their usual strategy isn't working as well. So that kind of mismatch between what they do and what they say they're doing, that could be strong evidence for unconscious strategy use.
Right. So looking for those moments where our actions speak louder than our conscious thoughts about our learning process. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the interactive layers model.
It has, hasn't it?
It really highlights how much of learning is happening beneath the surface thanks to these resonant states and the complex interactions between the different layers of our cognitive system.
What I find so exciting about this model is how it gives us a much richer appreciation for the complexity of learning, right? It's not just about conscious effort, it's about how our existing knowledge and expectations play this vital role in shaping how we acquire and process new information. And a lot of this is happening without us even being aware of it.
And it's so helpful to see how this framework can kind of give us new perspectives on some of these long-standing puzzles in education.
Absolutely. So here's a question for you to ponder. Think back to your own learning experiences. Have there been times when you just, kind of grasped a new concept almost effortlessly without really mapping out every step?
Okay.
Or times when you've performed a familiar task with such ease that it felt almost automatic?
Yeah, I think so.
Do you think maybe this idea of resonant states could offer a new way of understanding those moments? So how might this model shed light on your own personal learning strategies and maybe even some of the challenges you've encountered?
Yeah, food for thought. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into a very interesting model. And I think we've only just scratched the surface today.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more to explore. So until our next deep dive, keep those learning processes, conscious and unconscious, in mind.